Welcome back to the channel. Today we're looking at a real decision made under pressure, one that reshaped a war in a matter of days, and still influences how modern militaries think about risk, timing, and initiative. In September 1950, the Korean War was not moving toward a clean outcome. It was tightening into a corner. And in that corner, a single defensive line and a single port became the hinge of the entire conflict. By September 1950, the Korean War no longer resembled the limited conflict Washington had envisioned in June. In less than 10 weeks, United States and United Nations forces had been pushed south with a speed that broke normal planning cycles. Units arrived in theater without the usual buildup, fought while still reorganizing, and fell back again. On maps in Tokyo and Washington, the friendly held area shrank day by day until it looked less like a front and more like a contained pocket, one more successful breakthrough away from a collapse that would be impossible to disguise. The North Korean People's Army advanced with a combination of momentum and structure. Many of its troops had combat experience, and it fielded Soviet-supplied equipment that matched the tempo of modern maneuver war. The T-34 tank became the symbol of that imbalance in the war's opening months. U.S. and South Korean formations often lacked effective anti-tank weapons at the point of contact, and they were learning in real time how to fight an armored opponent. Early clashes were not always large, but they were decisive. A road junction lost, a bridge abandoned, a column forced to detour, each small failure compounding into a major retreat. By late August, the defensive line had compressed into a shrinking arc in the southeast. This final position ran generally along the Naktong River and down toward the coast, eventually receiving a name that sounded clean and geometric: the Pusan Perimeter. But the perimeter was not a fortress wall. It was a chain of hurriedly occupied hills, thinly held river lines, and improvised strongpoints, assembled by commanders who often had to choose where to stand based on what roads still existed and which units still had cohesion. Pusan itself was the real center of gravity. It was the last major port under UN control, and the war's entire supply system depended on it. Ships brought men, ammunition, fuel, vehicles, radios, and rations. The perimeter could be reinforced only because Pusan remained open. If that port fell, any retreat would likely become an evacuation under pressure, and evacuation under pressure tends to turn into disorder. In Washington, officials understood what would follow: not just a battlefield defeat, but a political shockwave across Asia and at home, with credibility on the line in the first major test of post-war American power. Holding the perimeter demanded constant adjustment. Commanders shifted battalions from one threatened sector to another, patching holes as they formed. Roads clogged with supply traffic and refugees moving away from the fighting. Terrain offered few easy solutions. Rice paddies restricted movement, hills created natural firing positions, and river crossings became magnets for attacks. The front line often moved not by miles, but by individual ridges and villages, places that mattered only because the next ridge controlled the road behind it. Air power was one of the few advantages UN forces could apply reliably. U.S. aircraft targeted bridges, rail lines, and supply columns, seeking to slow the enemy's ability to concentrate. But air power had limits. Weather could close the sky. Intelligence could lag behind a fast-moving ground situation, and an adaptive opponent could shift to night movement, dispersal, and camouflage. Airstrikes reduced the pace of advance, but they did not automatically restore initiative. They bought time, and time had to be converted into a better strategic position. Inside the perimeter, the human rhythm of the war became one of fatigue and improvisation. Some units held firm and regained confidence. Others arrived too late, too scattered, or too unprepared to stabilize their sector immediately. Soldiers slept in shallow positions, ate when supply trucks reached them, and fought in conditions that made even simple tasks, moving ammunition, laying communication wire, evacuating wounded, feel like logistical drills under threat. At this stage, victory was not the primary goal. The operational objective was survival. Keep the port open, keep the line connected, and keep enough combat power intact to change the equation later. It was in this environment that General Douglas MacArthur assessed the battlefield from a different angle. As Supreme Commander for the Far East and overall commander of UN forces, he viewed the Pusan Perimeter as a symptom rather than a solution. A successful defense, he believed, would only postpone the larger problem. If the war remained a straight contest of pressure on the perimeter, the initiative stayed with North Korea. The question was not whether Pusan could be held for a week or a month, but what would happen if the enemy found a weak seam, because eventually a seam would exist somewhere along a stretched defensive arc. MacArthur's logic was blunt. The war could not be won by defending Pusan alone. The enemy had to be forced to react. That meant striking deep, behind the advancing forces, in a way that threatened their logistics and command. Amphibious envelopment, landing a major force in the enemy's rear, was a classic method for breaking a stalemate and turning a defensive crisis into an offensive opportunity. But in Korea, the coastline and the ports presented brutal constraints. Many areas were heavily defended, others were hydrographically unsuitable, and any landing required overwhelming precision. One location remained on the map that combined strategic value with apparent impossibility: Inchon. For planners, it was a nightmare. Narrow approach channels, strong tidal swings, mudflats that could trap landing craft, and seawalls instead of beaches. Standard doctrine treated such a target as the wrong place to gamble. MacArthur treated it as the right place, precisely because it looked wrong. If it seemed impossible to American planners, it likely seemed impossible to North Korean planners as well. Surprise would not be a bonus, it would be the operating principle. By early September, the decision moved from argument to commitment. Planning accelerated under strict secrecy, coordinating naval forces, marine units, air cover, and a timetable built around tides rather than convenience. On the perimeter, soldiers continued fighting for ridges and river lines, largely unaware that the war's direction might soon be decided far away on a hostile western shoreline. The Pusan Perimeter's task was simple but unforgiving. Hold long enough for the gamble to be launched. Tell us what city you're from in the comments and subscribe to the channel. It's the best support, and we'll keep moving forward. The night of September 14, 1950, unfolded without dramatic movement, but every detail mattered. Offshore, the invasion fleet assembled with deliberate spacing and strict radio discipline along Korea's western coast. Aboard the transports were elements of the U.S. 1st Marine Division under Major General Oliver P. Smith, a formation rebuilt after years of post-war reductions. Their destination was Inchon. Their margin for error was narrow, not because of enemy strength, but because time, water, and geography allowed almost no flexibility. Operation Chromite was defined by tides more than by firepower. Inchon's tidal range exceeded 8 meters, exposing vast mudflats at low tide and flooding narrow channels at high tide. Amphibious doctrine favored predictable beaches and gradual gradients. Inchon offered neither. The usable windows opened twice a day and lasted less than 3 hours. Miss the timing, and landing craft would ground in mud, immobilized and vulnerable. Every schedule, from airstrikes to ship movements, was synchronized to those tidal calculations. At 6:30 on September 15th, the preparatory phase began. Naval aviation and U.S. Air Force aircraft struck pre-selected targets: coastal batteries, communication sites, and suspected troop concentrations. The intent was not indiscriminate destruction, but focused suppression. Commanders needed the port functional after capture. Shortly afterward, surface ships joined the effort, their fire controlled and deliberate, aimed to neutralize resistance without collapsing the infrastructure required for rapid unloading. Vice Admiral Arthur D. Struble, directed the naval approach. His task was among the most technically demanding of the war. Large vessels moved through a constricted channel where deviation meant grounding or collision. Minesweepers had worked in advance, but charts remained imperfect. Navigation proceeded slowly, guided by markers placed under cover of darkness. Discipline on the bridges was absolute. There would be no second attempt if the timing failed. Around 6:50, the first assault wave moved toward the harbor. What confronted the Marines bore little resemblance to standard amphibious landings. There were no beaches to run across, no dunes to shelter behind. Instead, landing craft struck stone seawalls rising several meters above the waterline. Steel ladders were deployed immediately. Marines climbed with full equipment, exposed and compressed into narrow access points. In those moments, the operation was most fragile. The anticipated resistance did not materialize in force. North Korean units in the area were few, dispersed, and not prepared to contest a major landing. Their defensive planning had focused elsewhere, primarily on the southern front near Pusan. As Marines reached the top of the seawalls, resistance was localized and disorganized. By approximately 7:30, key sections of the waterfront were secured, and follow-on waves expanded the perimeter inland. By midday, control of Inchon was effectively established. This transition occurred with remarkable speed. Within hours, engineers cleared obstacles, communications were restored, and unloading began. Vehicles, artillery, and supplies moved ashore in increasing volume. A port that had been considered unusable for an assault proved capable of sustaining rapid logistical flow once secured. The success validated the central assumption of the plan. If the landing succeeded, the operational payoff would be immediate. Responsibility for the land campaign now shifted to 10th Corps, commanded by Major General Edward Almond. His directive emphasized tempo. Seoul lay roughly 40 kilometers inland, connected by limited road networks that crossed rivers and urban choke points. Speed was essential not only to reclaim the capital, but to sever the logistical arteries supporting North Korean forces still pressing the Pusan Perimeter. Delay would give the enemy time to reposition. As UN forces advanced eastward, resistance increased. The approach to Seoul marked a transition from maneuver to urban fighting. Beginning on September 22nd, engagements took place among dense neighborhoods, intersections, and fortified buildings. North Korean defenders used the city's layout to slow progress, establishing positions that required systematic clearance. Movement became deliberate, coordinated, and costly in time rather than territory. Despite the resistance, momentum remained with the attackers. Units advanced block by block, supported by armor, artillery, and air observation. Supply lines from Inchon shortened the logistical loop, allowing sustained pressure. On September 28, 1950, Seoul was formally declared liberated. The political symbolism was immediate, but the military implications were more decisive. Control of the capital disrupted enemy command structures and cut major supply routes running south. For North Korean forces operating near Pusan, the consequences were severe. Their rear areas were compromised, lines of communication broken, and withdrawal routes threatened. Units that had advanced methodically now retreated under pressure, often abandoning equipment and cohesion. What had been a steady offensive unraveled into fragmented movement northward, with formations losing contact and purpose. The transformation of the strategic situation occurred in less than 2 weeks. A force on the brink of containment regained initiative and reversed the direction of the war. Yet embedded within this success was an emerging assumption that the enemy's collapse was complete. The speed of victory suggested finality. That assumption, formed in the wake of Inchon's success, would soon shape decisions whose consequences extended far beyond the port where the tide had first turned. In early October 1950, confidence shaped nearly every assessment made within UN headquarters. The speed of the turnaround after Inchon and the recapture of Seoul appeared to confirm the belief that the North Korean People's Army had been decisively broken. Prisoners were taken in large numbers, often without resistance. Equipment lay abandoned along roads and in fields. Reports reaching senior commanders described an enemy no longer capable of coordinated defense, reinforcing the impression that the decisive phase of the war had already passed. On October 1, 1950, South Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel, the line that had divided the peninsula since 1945. Within days, American and other UN units followed. The decision carried political weight. It was approved in Washington despite warnings from diplomats who cautioned that crossing the boundary risked widening the conflict. The original mandate, repelling aggression and restoring South Korea, expanded quietly into an effort to eliminate the northern regime altogether. General Douglas MacArthur viewed the moment as an opportunity that would not return. In his assessments, the North Korean army no longer existed as an effective fighting force. He argued that rapid movement north would prevent the enemy from regrouping and would bring the war to a swift conclusion. Public statements reflected this confidence. The phrase, "home by Christmas," circulated through command channels, becoming shorthand for the belief that organized resistance was nearing its end. The advance north unfolded at remarkable speed. Columns moved along damaged roads with little opposition. Villages and towns were entered without combat. For soldiers who had spent weeks retreating and defending under pressure, the absence of contact felt like confirmation that the war had been won. Yet this rapid movement created structural weaknesses. Units advanced faster than their supply systems could reliably support, and coordination between formations became increasingly uneven. As distances grew, so did gaps between units. Communications were strained by terrain and weather. Fuel, ammunition, and food traveled hundreds of kilometers from ports and depots. Intelligence reports became contradictory. Some patrols reported scattered enemy presence. Others encountered nothing at all. Rather than raising concern, this lack of contact was widely interpreted as evidence of total enemy collapse. This interpretation proved decisive. The absence of resistance was not the result of defeat, but of deliberate withdrawal and concealment. North Korean remnants moved out of contact, while another force prepared to enter the war under different conditions. The quiet along the roads masked activity elsewhere, beyond the immediate focus of UN planners. North of the Yalu River, the situation looked fundamentally different. Chinese leadership viewed the advance of UN forces toward their border as a direct threat to national security. The presence of American troops near Manchuria carried historical and strategic implications that could not be ignored. Messages warning of possible intervention were conveyed through diplomatic channels, but they were largely dismissed as attempts at intimidation rather than indicators of imminent action. By mid-October, Chinese forces began crossing into Korea in small groups. Their movement was methodical and concealed. They traveled primarily at night, avoided roads, and operated without radio communication to reduce detection. The terrain favored their approach. Mountains, forests, and narrow valleys offered cover from air observation. Their objective was not immediate confrontation, but positioning. The first significant clashes occurred on 25 October 1950, when Chinese units struck South Korean formations in central Korea. The attacks were sharp and brief, followed by rapid withdrawal. UN command categorized the engagements as limited probes rather than the opening of a broader offensive. This assessment reinforced the belief that no large-scale intervention was underway. That conclusion did not survive November. On the night of 27 November 1950, Chinese forces launched coordinated attacks across multiple sectors of the front. UN units, dispersed and extended, were struck almost simultaneously. In the northeast, near the Chosin Reservoir, American Marines faced sudden encirclement under extreme winter conditions. Elsewhere, units found their supply lines threatened or cut entirely. The shift was immediate and unmistakable. The advance halted, not by order, but by necessity. Confidence evaporated as reports of heavy contact replaced weeks of relative quiet. The assumption of a finished war collapsed under the reality of a new, well-prepared opponent. What followed was not a continuation of earlier momentum, but a struggle to stabilize, withdraw, and reassess. The success at Inchon had reversed the direction of the war, but it had also shaped expectations that proved dangerous. Tactical brilliance and operational speed had created an illusion of finality. The events of late 1950 exposed the cost of underestimating political boundaries and strategic depth. The conflict that followed would not be brief, and it would unfold under conditions far harsher than those that preceded it. The collapse of the UN advance became most visible in the mountains of northeast Korea, where geography, weather, and miscalculation converged. By late November 1950, elements of U.S. 10 Corps were pushing north along two separated axes toward the Yalu River. In the east, the 1st Marine Division advanced inland from the coast toward the Chosin Reservoir, a sparsely populated plateau encircled by steep ridgelines and narrow roads. On maps, the movement appeared deliberate and confident. On the ground, it was fragile. This deployment reflected the dominant assumptions of the period. Intelligence estimates consistently underestimated the scale and intent of Chinese forces, while overstating the disintegration of North Korean units. Commanders expected only scattered resistance and believed remaining enemy elements lacked coordination. Terrain was classified as difficult but passable. Winter was acknowledged as a complicating factor, yet it was treated as a condition to endure rather than a decisive variable that could shape operations. By November 26, 1950, the environment imposed its own reality. Temperatures dropped below -25 degrees Celsius and continued falling. Fuel thickened, and engines failed without warning. Small arms and heavy weapons malfunctioned as lubricants froze. Frostbite casualties rose rapidly, often outpacing combat injuries. Medical evacuation slowed dramatically as aircraft struggled with weather and limited landing zones. Roads were narrow, icy mountain tracks where a single disabled vehicle could halt an entire column. UN units in the region were spread across wide distances with minimal lateral contact. The road network dictated movement, forcing formations into linear deployments that were difficult to reinforce or withdraw from quickly. Communication between units became unreliable, constrained by terrain and weather. Under these conditions, the margin for error was already narrow before the enemy acted. On the night of November 27, 1950, Chinese forces initiated their offensive. The attacks were synchronized and deliberate. They came from multiple directions, striking exposed units nearly simultaneously. Bugles echoed across the frozen hills, serving both as signals and psychological markers of coordination. Chinese infantry infiltrated through gaps between UN positions, bypassing strongpoints to target command elements, supply areas, and artillery sites. The aim was not immediate destruction, but isolation, breaking cohesion and surrounding units before they could respond effectively. At the Chosin Reservoir, the consequences became unmistakable. The 1st Marine Division found itself encircled by forces that had remained unseen only days earlier. Supply routes were threatened, and forward units faced pressure from all sides. The environment magnified every problem. Darkness lasted longer, movement was slower, and exposure carried immediate physical risk. The situation demanded decisions measured in survival rather than maneuver. Major General Oliver P. Smith, commanding the division, recognized the nature of the crisis quickly. There would be no rapid breakout and no relief arriving in time. The priority shifted from advancing to preserving combat power. Smith issued clear and disciplined orders. The division would not fragment. Units would withdraw methodically, maintaining mutual support and control. Movement would be deliberate, even under pressure. This distinction mattered because it preserved structure. Rather than collapsing into isolated retreats, Marine units moved as a coordinated force. Defensive perimeters were established nightly, allowing rest, reorganization, and medical treatment where possible. Artillery and air support were integrated carefully to cover withdrawals. Engineers worked continuously to clear or repair roads under threat, often in full view of enemy positions. From late November into early December, the Marines fought their way south in what became known as the Chosin Reservoir Campaign. Engagements occurred at close range, often in darkness or blowing snow. Ammunition was distributed by hand when vehicles could not reach forward positions. Wounded personnel were transported on trucks that became priority targets. Every kilometer gained required planning and discipline rather than speed. Despite encirclement and sustained pressure, cohesion held. Weather limited air support, but when conditions allowed, aircraft provided critical suppression and resupply. Leadership at small unit level proved decisive, maintaining order under conditions that eroded physical endurance rapidly. The withdrawal was not a rout. It was a continuous series of defensive actions linked by controlled movement. The cost was severe. Thousands of UN troops were killed, wounded, or incapacitated by frostbite. Equipment was abandoned when recovery became impossible. Yet the division remained intact as a fighting force. By the 11th of December 1950, Marine units reached the port of Hungnam, where a large-scale evacuation was already underway, extracting forces before encirclement could tighten further. The Chosin campaign overturned earlier assumptions about the war. The enemy was neither exhausted nor disorganized. He was present in large numbers, capable of coordination, and willing to fight under conditions that neutralized technological advantages. The belief that momentum alone could conclude the conflict collapsed in the frozen mountains. Chosin marked the definitive end of the illusion of a quick victory. What followed would be shaped not by speed or surprise, but by endurance, limits, and the recognition that the war had entered a far more complex and unforgiving phase. As reports from Chosin and Central Korea reached Washington, the strategic picture changed almost overnight. What had been described weeks earlier as a collapsing enemy was now clearly a reorganized and expanding threat. The UN advance halted across the peninsula. In several sectors, orderly withdrawal deteriorated into fragmentation under pressure. By January 1951, Seoul was evacuated for the second time in the war. The loss of the capital carried less shock than it had the first time, but it confirmed a deeper reality. Momentum had shifted decisively. The rapid offensive phase that followed Inchon was over, replaced by a struggle to prevent further collapse. Chinese intervention fundamentally altered the balance of forces. Intelligence estimates now placed Chinese troop strength in Korea at more than 300,000. These forces operated with limited mechanization but high discipline. Their logistics relied on manpower rather than vehicles, reducing vulnerability to air attack and allowing sustained pressure in difficult terrain. Chinese units avoided predictable movement. They traveled at night, dispersed during daylight, and used terrain to mask concentrations. Supply lines were simple but resilient. Food, ammunition, and reinforcements moved forward continuously, even in winter conditions that paralyzed mechanized forces. UN forces faced the opposite problem. Their operational effectiveness depended on long, exposed supply routes. Roads were limited, weather was severe, and fuel and ammunition consumption was high. Winter amplified every logistical weakness, slowing movement and reducing flexibility at all levels of command. The military situation quickly became a political crisis. General Douglas MacArthur argued that the war could still be won, but only by expanding its scope. He proposed strikes against Chinese bases north of the Yalu River and the introduction of nationalist Chinese forces from Taiwan. These measures risked drawing additional powers into the conflict. President Harry S. Truman rejected this course. His objective remained a limited war with defined boundaries. Escalation, in his view, risked a wider confrontation that could no longer be controlled. The disagreement was not only strategic but constitutional, touching directly on civilian control of the military. As MacArthur continued to express his views publicly, the divide widened. The issue moved beyond operational judgment and into the realm of authority. In April 1951, Truman relieved MacArthur of command. The decision provoked controversy but established a clear line of responsibility. General Matthew Ridgway assumed command with a different emphasis. His priority was stabilization rather than dramatic maneuver. He focused on restoring discipline, morale, and coherence to forces that had been under continuous pressure since November. Ridgway reorganized the front deliberately. Defensive positions were chosen for sustainability rather than symbolism. Units were rotated out of the line, reinforced, and resupplied. Artillery and air power were applied methodically, not for breakthrough, but for control. By mid-1951, the front stabilized near the original 38th parallel. Neither side possessed the political freedom or military capacity to impose a decisive outcome. Negotiations began in July, marking the transition from mobile war to prolonged stalemate. Operation Chromite remains one of the most examined amphibious operations in modern military history because it achieved what few operations manage under pressure: a complete reversal of strategic momentum. Risk, precise timing, and surprise combined to turn a defensive crisis into an offensive opportunity. Inchon was not simply a battlefield success, it altered the direction of an entire campaign. Its significance lay not in the number of enemy units destroyed, but in the shock it delivered to the opposing command system. A force concentrated at the southern end of the peninsula suddenly found its rear threatened. Supply lines collapsed, communications failed, and initiative shifted almost instantly to UN forces. Yet the aftermath of Inchon revealed an equally important reality. Military success did not exist in isolation. The operation succeeded within a narrow window defined by geography, intelligence assumptions, and political tolerance. Once those conditions changed, its effects could not be extended indefinitely. The subsequent advance north reflected confidence born of speed and success. Warning signs were visible but discounted. Terrain became more restrictive, supply lines lengthened, and intelligence gaps widened. These factors were treated as manageable complications rather than strategic constraints. Geopolitics proved decisive. The approach of UN forces toward the Yalu River transformed the conflict from a regional war into a perceived security threat for China. Intervention followed not because of battlefield collapse, but because political thresholds were crossed. By late 1950, the Korean War assumed its lasting form. Rapid movement gave way to positional fighting. Objectives narrowed, and the front stabilized. What remained was not a campaign aimed at decisive victory, but a conflict shaped by limits, military, political, and geographic. Fighting continued under these conditions for nearly 3 years. Gains were measured in kilometers, sometimes in meters. Casualties accumulated without producing strategic resolution. Neither side possessed the freedom to escalate without risking wider consequences. The central lesson emerged slowly and at high cost. Tactical brilliance, even at the operational level, could not substitute for strategic alignment. Inchon demonstrated what bold action could accomplish. Chosin demonstrated the consequences of assuming success had settled the larger question. The war concluded in 1953, not with victory or defeat, but with an armistice. The line of separation remained close to where it had been drawn before the fighting began. No peace treaty followed. The peninsula remained divided. What changed was not the map, but understanding. Korea showed that modern wars could be fought intensely without reaching final outcomes, that battlefield success could coexist with strategic stalemate, and that political limits could shape warfare as decisively as firepower. In this sense, Inchon was both a triumph and a warning. It proved that wars can be turned by decisive action, and that turning a war is not the same as ending it. This was a story about decisions made under pressure and the consequences that followed long after the moment had passed. The Korean War showed how quickly momentum can change and how success on the battlefield does not always lead to resolution. Thank you for watching and for staying with us through this chapter of history. Subscribe to the channel to support our work, and we'll continue exploring the moments that shaped the modern world.